You're listening to Write Right with the Story Perfect Editing team. Visit us at www.storyperfectediting.com for more information on developmental editing, copy editing, and proofreading services for your writing. Season 1, Episode 3. Hello, and welcome to Episode 3 of the Write Right podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Elon. I am a proofreader and apprentice editor, and I'm currently drinking about a finger and a half of Johnny Walker Blue Label, and it is delightful. Let's kick it over to you, John.
Well, I'm John Robin. I'm the senior editor with Story Perfect Editing Services, and I am here today with a little bit of Kraken rum. It's Saturday. I figure I deserve a little bit of indulgence.
You certainly do. How about you, Katie?
I'm Katie. I'm an editor at Story Perfect, and I've been doing it for, most of my life, it seems like now. I am drinking The Blood of the Young, and I'm currently reading Deadpool in the Marvel series, because who doesn't like a little breaking the fourth wall? Dale, how about you?
Me. I'm Dale. I'm an apprentice editor and beta reader, and as well as something else I completely forgot. It's off the top of my head right now. I'm drinking Nest tea. Iced tea, basically, and it's pretty good. And I'm also reading Political Ideologies, Their Origins and Impact by Leon Baradot.
Fancy.
How about you, Tyler?
Hello, I'm Tyler. I'm currently drinking some very generic Bach red wine. Also, I'm reading some Writer's Digest books on how to write great fiction. Figured I could get some insight.
Awesome. I forgot to say what I was reading. I'm reading Haruki Murakami's The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. It's so weird.
Yeah,
great. It's
I've
great.
Read that
it's
before.
Just so weird.
It is indeed.
But everything he does is weird. Yeah.
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 I forgot my book as well. I should say that I'm reading a book called Story Trumps Structure by Stephen James. I alternate between the two. I know I mentioned last time that I'm reading Stephen Erickson's Gardens of the Moon, but I like to also read a little bit of craft on the side. It's a great book about how to really create a tense story.
I'm a fan of Stephen James.
I think he's a great book in my Kindle somewhere.
Yeah,
I bought
highly recommended.
a 30-book set from a story bundle that was all about writing tools and things like that. Some really great materials in there. So our topic this time is narration and person, and it connects pretty directly to our last episode, which was about tense. In fact, I thought there was something rather interesting that kept happening in last episode. We were, for lack of a better word, we were conflating tense with person. We kept on referring to past as third person and present as first person. And I think there's a really natural assumption that third person present might not be as you don't expect that as much as you expect first present tense to be first person, and the same is true of third person with the past. So there's definitely a very linear connection between that topic and this one. So let's sort of jump right into it. I feel like Dale last time was saying something really fascinating, and I want you to say whatever it is that's on your mind at any point in time this episode.
Just make sure it's fascinating.
Yeah, no pressure. So, John was saying last episode that if you're in doubt, you should go with third person. And that advice came from Brandon Sanderson's Write About Dragons YouTube series, which I highly recommend to anyone looking to write fantasy or science fiction. It's an incredible wealth of resources. Brandon Sanderson is rather successful, so I'm sure you can trust his judgment when it comes to some of the more technical writing advice. But there was something that we talked about after we stopped recording, which was this idea that you don't have to stick to one person and one tense in the same story. John was talking about a book he was editing. So do you wanna bring that back up, John?
Okay. Well, one of the projects I worked on was erotica, and that's a very interesting genre. That's one where we talked last time about when do you use present, when do you use past, and we didn't mention erotica, so I thought it would be great to bring that up this time. this book had actually all four possibilities: first person present, first person past, third person present, third person past. And the author very cleverly chose which narrator got the different tenses. So, for example, he had a very spontaneous, impulsive, live in the now kind of character, and this character's story was told first person present. And so when you were there, you just felt like you were like right there. It's happening right away. And of course, with this type of genre, I mean that's not a bad thing, right?
Exactly.
And then he had another character who was very emotional, and it was sort of actually he had two characters who he chose first person past tense. And the thing about first person versus third is first person is very intimate. It's sort of like you really like stepping into somebody's diary or into their
Yeah.
own personal thoughts. And so for these two characters who were kind of like the two love interests and will they ever get together, that was sort of that went on throughout it was a series of five stories that became one book. So these characters, I mean, there was a little bit of distance, but it was a little bit more internal what was happening, a lot more reflective. So I thought it was a great choice. And then he had another character who was a bit of an older fellow, and he was not a frequent character, but it was interesting because he chose third person past for that tense or for that character's story. Um, and it was interesting because the guy normally was sort of like an observer, and most of the characters were these young, impulsive, young, impulsive men who were leading the high life, and you have this older person who's kind of watching them and almost a little bit like a father figure. So it was interesting using that mode. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. There was a third person present, and I think that was also somebody who was a little bit distant, and they were also really in the now. So it was
There's
just it
something
was
sort of delightfully Faulkner about that, because
Yeah.
Faulkner was weird with tenses and switches like that, and I think it's really clever, and it's a really good way to say something about your characters without saying anything.
hmm,
Yeah.
yeah.
My question would
Paralinguistic
be,
communication.
Hmm.
when you have that many different characters that are in different tenses, how do you like place them in time according to
Like
each other?
together.
Yeah, like when you're thinking about the characters as a whole and the whole story that's happening, how would the reader associate them in time together?
I think it's pretty standard when people, unless you're told otherwise. Often when you read a book, your assumption is that it's in order, unless there are events that indicate that it'll go a different way. Now, to make sure that it was clear with this book, it was structured by days, so things happened on different days of the week, and those were actually in the headers. So you saw there was a chronological order to everything, but also the way that it was told, there was no sense of somebody in a distant future telling something that happened long ago. Actually, one thing that when I was apprenticing as an editor, one thing that one of my overseeing editors mentioned when they were talking about the past tense, it's not necessarily long, long ago. Often the past tense is just a couple seconds ago, and
Right.
it's mimicking real life where we don't actually live in the present. We live technically like a split second in the past. We've got these
Yeah.
experiences that just happened to us, and now we're zoomed ahead. And so,
Yeah.
third person past is modeling that idea, depending on how you tell it. But there is always, like in the detective novel, or mysteries, where you're telling the story as it happened, and then that's usually framed in such a way. So, I mean, if you were mixing that up in your story, that would definitely create a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
Sometimes
fascinating way of putting it.
I I don't want to say I prefer first person, but I feel like most of the books I read for fun are in first person. Because I like that, like a lot of times with first person, you don't get all the information about who that person is right away. A lot of times you
Mhm.
don't know their name or their gender or really
Mhm.
any of that, and you're led to make assumptions that sometimes are wrong. And I think that's really fun. And I think as a writer, that's something to aim for. is to sort of confuse people with that. I mean, not on purpose if that's not your thing, but I think it's super fun to confuse people by making it the gender or just like making the person somehow not expected. And that's something you can't do in the third person.
Well, I actually was going to say I read Anne Lecquie's Ancillary Justice. It's a spectacular sci-fi novel. Just definitely go read it. Oh my god, you have to.
On my
go
list.
do it. It's so good.
Me too.
So what she does that's fascinating is she has her story in third person past, and her mechanism for confusing gender is her character can't perceive it.
Oh, that's amazing.
And she uses female pronouns for everything. And so you learn the gender of characters over time by their actions. And sometimes you never learn it. And you learn also that it just doesn't really matter, which is an awesome experience as a reader. You assume all of this stuff about characters based on, on the female pronouns, and then as the story progresses and as you continue to read it, and you just that assumption starts to vanish, and you just see these things as people, and then eventually gender settles into place, but it never really mattered. And it was a really cool experience as a reader.
Delightful.
Oh, it's such a good book, and the whole trilogy is out. So if you can burn through it, and she was a Hugo winner, and she's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, there's an author who just who released a book, and he's sort of notoriously chauvinistic and sexist, and he wrote a first-person female protagonist, and pretty much people are up in arms because they've just perceived it as his justification of sexism from her perspective, being yeah, of course I want to be taken care of, and and he's just using it. And a lot of people do question whether they can write a first-person perspective that's not their own. I have trouble with it. Every time I write first person, they are sassy as and I just can't seem to make them a serious person when I'm in first person. So I always switch to third if I want them to be different than me. That's my tool for that. But I know some people are really great at it. But
when I write first person, I end up writing women.
Really?
And I don't know. I wonder what that means about me. But we can talk about that.
I don't
on
feel
the couch.
like we have the resources.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we can get into some interesting psychology if we want.
The thing is what I decided. I recently read a friend's manuscript that was in the first person, and she's not heavy on physical descriptions. So gender, but you don't really know. And I realized that you could race swap or gender swap most of her characters, and it wouldn't make a difference. And I think
recently J.K. Rowling actually backed the notion of a black Hermione, saying that she didn't give enough character description.
That.
All it said was that she had a certain type of hair and that she was very intelligent. There's nothing saying that she's not a certain way. You all just imagined her that way.
Yeah, and
so
that's just says something the readers just they put whatever they want onto those characters. But I think sometimes as a writer, it's nice to leave those open so that there are really broad perceptions of your characters. Instead of being well, we all know what Bella from Twilight looks like because she covered it, man. She covered it pretty well, repeatedly. So I get it. Good brunette. But I think it's nice if when they're made into a movie and the casting, people get all upset. But as long as that person can encapsulate whatever the base characteristics are, I've never found it to be a problem or make a difference. And Absolutely. I think that's sort of an important part of writing well-rounded characters, especially from the first person, when you are dealing with a protagonist's perceptions of other people. It's just a really interesting way to go through the book. And then that first person really colors your whole perception of the novel and the other characters in it.
Absolutely. We are right about at the 10-minute mark, so let's break for our little ad for ourselves. So we are Story Perfect Editing Services, and we provide developmental editing, copy editing, and proofreading services for self-pub and indie authors. And in our first episode, John gave a really powerful and impassioned speech about the benefits of having a team work on your book. And in my experience as an apprentice, I can say absolutely without a doubt that the work I've seen and the editing that's been done on it has made it really, really strong. We don't have a pitch for it. Does anyone have a pitch for it? Did I forget that we have a actual pitch for Story Perfect?
Let's make a tagline.
Let's make a tagline. Story Perfect editing, because
Because you need us.
yeah,
I like that.
everyone needs an editor. No one
Everyone,
is above
editors need
editing.
editors.
Yeah, totally. That's a
We
great
could
one.
say something like the power of pulling the power of 3 from the traditional model. You know,
There you go.
There you go. We can
I like it.
work with that.
Okay.
You know, because that's what we do. It's a lot of times when people self-publish, they I got to get an editor. They get someone to read it over and fix the grammar and maybe make a couple suggestions, and then that's it. But in the traditional industry, you get 3 editors generally. It goes to the higher level developmental editor, and there's some interaction there. Then there's a copy editor who's a totally different person, different set of eyes, different focus. And then there's a final proofreader who looks it all over. Sometimes there's many people, but there's always those 3, and that's what we build ourselves around.
Awesome. That was beautifully done. So let's hop back into our discussion of narration in person. So we were just talking about how you can achieve sort of intentionally vague character through certain mechanisms of description or lack thereof. John Scalzi, I think, I haven't read this book, but he wrote a book evidently where the protagonist can be read as male or female, and you don't know the entire book. And so the audiobook actually has 2 versions, one with a male narrator, who I believe was Will Wheaton, and one with a lady narrator, whose name I do not know, and I am ashamed. But I think it's called Lock In. I'm not sure. I'm not positive. But it sounded really interesting to me when I heard that, because, you know, words, as writers and as editors, we have this infinitely variable tool, and it's interesting to see how frequently it gets used in a very limited number of ways. And so it's nice to hear about books like the erotica novel John edited that had Jesus, edit that. That had so many uses of person and tense. And I was working on a project for a while that had 2 characters, one of whom was first person, the other was going to be third person, and then they were going to merge into a single character, and I was going to drop it into third person at that point for the rest of the novel. But you're not limited to this single tense for your entire, your single narrator, your single person, your single tense for the entire novel, and you can have a really, really strong impact by making, you know, these very intentioned switches. But as editors, have you seen anyone doing these things besides you, John, who you absolutely just did? And B, what do you think are some of like the key critical pitfalls that should be avoided when trying too many things like that?
So we've been talking about third person, but I feel like we've sort of made the assumption that it's third person limited.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to talk a little bit about third person omniscient, which I am not a fan of. And it's a pretty old like storytelling technique, and I get it. But as far as like writing goes, where there's a narrator who knows everything, and they hint about it a lot, if you know what I mean, they go, and they were about to find out. You know, like I am not a huge fan of those lead-ins from narration.
I think
but
because it detaches. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go. Please.
Okay, I was gonna say I think it's because it detaches you from the immersion of the story. Like you, when it's in third person like that, you're keenly aware of the narrator, and that kind of like brings you out of the actual story that's taking place, and that might be like the source of some of the annoyance for you.
No, for sure. I mean, it is definitely like an older storytelling technique, but I feel like unless it's a fairy tale, I'm not like super interested in those kinds of like bombs being dropped from that perspective. And I haven't edited too much where there has been intentional switching between first and third. I've read a lot of unintentional switching.
That needed correcting.
But not too much intentionally.
For me, I'm sorry, I must be lagging or something. I keep accidentally talking over people.
It's no problem. Go for it.
I was gonna say that brings up a comment for me and a question for John actually. Third person limited gives you a lot of play with narrative distance. Like you can, it almost seems like you can get really close to writing in first person with third person limited. In situations like with John's book, his characters are in third person, but they're really, really, really intimate with the character's thoughts and everything. And that brings up the question: what made you want to write in third person limited versus first person, being as your book is really involved with the characters?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think it's going back to the rule that we mentioned opening this episode, where when in doubt, use third person. In reflecting on the book and as I started telling the story, it really felt right to use third person limited. And as you've noted, Tyler, the third person limited doesn't actually limit you from getting intimate with your characters. In fact, I think it tends to, I mean, I almost could compare the two, like in terms of closeness. You don't have to lose that because of the beautiful thing about monologue and our ability to get right inside our characters' heads and their thoughts. I think um, I think the difference between using third and using first comes down to just, I guess, a choice of how I wanted to tell the story. I didn't want it to feel like vignettes or tales that people were telling you about something that happened. I wanted you to feel like you're sort of there in a movie, and you're right alongside the characters, where you can see into what's happening. And of course, with the limited point of view, it models human experience, where I'm sitting here right now, and the suspense I encounter is not knowing what other people are thinking or not knowing what's about to happen.
Yeah.
And that's just as valid an experience as, if I told it first person like you were reading my journal, it would have a bit of a different feel to it.
I would
I think
argue that third person limited, sorry, Elon,
No
is
worries.
actually limited in the opposite direction, where you know a lot about the characters and a limited amount about the world, like outside of your protagonists and your main characters. Like, I feel like almost always you get a pretty good, like, you get very intimate and close with characters, even in third person, but that your knowledge of just like the people around them and the world around them is what's limited.
I see
think
what
that
you're saying. Like as
Oh,
in
sorry.
first person, you're mainly going off of observations that the protagonist is making, versus in third person, all of that is in the narration.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
To me, it seems like there's an apt metaphor in one of John's statements about it being kind of like a movie. And if you think about person narration kind of as a camera that's on a rail, right? And like first person, your camera is in your character's eyes and therefore limited extremely by what they're able to see. Third person limited, you have this enormous range of flexibility where you can be right up into the back of the character's head, all the way back out to far enough that you can have a pretty big scope of what is visible, and you can even move the camera to wherever you want, different characters, different settings and sceneries. But if you have third person omniscient, you're limited to this very far out view.
Yeah.
And so it seems like the reason maybe people go with third person, specifically third person limited, is for that flexibility. And it feels very natural to fall into that as a storyteller. I could be wrong, but I read so many books like this, and it seems like there is that flexibility.
Third person omniscient implies the presence of someone else. And that, as a reader, raises a lot of questions for me. Like, I end up really wondering about the narrator. In third person limited, there's no narrator. There's a narrative voice, but there's no narrator, if that makes sense. Like, this omniscient feels like a person, but it's like Morgan Freeman or something. Like somebody way away, godlike, who gets to know everything, who you want to know more about, and then that's like a whole complicated relationship you have with an extra character, basically.
I can't remember.
Sorry.
Sorry. I can't remember the name of the book, but the narrator was Death. Do you remember the name of the book? It was about had something to do with the Holocaust. It recently came out and it was a movie. I just can't remember the name of it. But anyway, if nobody remembers the name of the book, it might come to me later. But it was interesting because to choose the narrator as Death when you're telling a story about the Holocaust. That was apparently the author told the whole book in third person limited, and something just felt wrong, and they didn't know what. Their editor told them this is not, it's just not working. And then finally they had the insight to tell it in an omniscient narration where the narrator was deaf. So, there's a good example right there of where the choice could actually really tell your story the way it's supposed to be told, versus doing it carelessly just because, oh, I want to head hop. I don't want to set things up structurally,
And going back to Tyler's question about how to choose, I think, like, for me, it's never it's never much of like a cognitive choice. It's like, how do I want to write it? And that's the way I try to write it first. In my current project, I was writing it, and then it felt like I was missing a lot of information. It is third person limited, but I added, I have two characters who were not together all the time, and we were missing like all this information. So I just do a perspective switch. It's third person limited with her, and then it switches to third person limited with him, so that the world is complete but still limited. There's no omniscience. Mm-hmm. And that felt to me like it solved my problem, and then I could keep writing. And really, that's about as cognitive, as like conscious as I get about choosing those without being like experimental, really.
I think that's a great point, Katie.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Tyler.
I was gonna say, how do you guys feel about somebody who starts out like from an omniscient viewpoint, but then zooms in, like to establish setting, but then zooms into a third person limited? Is that acceptable?
The beginning of every single Wheel of Time novel does this.
Yeah, it's basically we were talking about prologues in the first episode.
Totally,
most
totally.
prologues do this.
Mm-hmm.
I think at the end of the day, it's about reader confidence. When you're reading a book, do you feel confident that this author knows what they're doing and is doing it deliberately? And also the effect, because you could do something deliberately and have the wrong effect. So you always need to consider your audience. Who's reading this? How are they going to respond to it? Is this having the effect you want to have to tell the story you want to tell? You can really do anything you want. There are no rules. I mean, the story's going to trump everything, but there's effects, and that's why there's rules, because the rules exist. Because when you do things and you mess around, certain things happen, and we have the rules to help deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not all James Joyce. We can't all like jump in and win at it. But it's certainly helpful, I think, sometimes as a writing experiment, and just to like help yourself be creative and get out of that headspace sometimes, to switch the perspective and write separately. Like sometimes I will write things separately from my manuscript in a different perspective, and then take those events and add them in, just to make sure that, like John said, like I'm confident in that those events happened and this is how it happened, and that helps me sound more confident when I add it into the material.
I think that's actually a great writing prompt that we could give our listeners, if they're so inclined, to say, you have your protagonist, and they're doing something somewhere. Tell that event from the perspective of someone watching.
Yeah, that's a great prompt.
Yeah.
We are right at a few minutes over time. Does anyone have any final thoughts on narration in person?
Write how you want to write first. That's my advice. Write how it feels good, and then if it feels bad later, change it. Get experimental.
It can always be fixed.
Like, exactly. Like John said in the previous episode, it's all about the simplest answer. Sometimes you just need to write what comes to you, and then if you need to change person, you can. And in the end, it will probably be really helpful to you, like with that project and as a writer.
Yeah, I think to echo what Dale said in the previous episode at our closing remarks, keep it simple. A lot of times you wanna be James Joyce, or you wanna mess around with things, and it goes with art. This goes with a lot of things that a lot of artistic endeavors. It's often the simplest, elegant thing works. Choosing how to tell your story is, as you said, Katie, it's not so much a rational thing where you work it out in a formula sheet. It's very intuitive. It's almost on a spiritual level. That's how I personally relate.
I agree totally.
There's like a Zen or a meditation or whatever. You have to feel it, and it aligns and resonates inside, and you just know when you got your story the right way. So you just listen to that rather than being complicated and artsy. And then when you choose what you're going to tell your story, and you could figure out rules of the certain tense just to make sure you're consistent.
That's some
And if you're
wonderful
confused,
advice.
call Story Perfect.
Yeah, totally. It's
Yeah,
that's the
right.
bottom
We'll
line,
help
right?
you.
It's you have a story to tell it, and then get some editors to help you just sort of tweak it so that it's perfect,
That's
or
right.
as close to perfect as you can get. That just about
Perfectly
wraps her up.
imperfect.
Thank you so much for joining the podcast, fellow podcasters, and for you, listeners. Thank you for joining us, and be on the lookout for the next episode next month.